Puccini is one of the three most performed opera composers in the world, and he has been for quite some time, alongside Verdi and Mozart, but with much fewer operas. What also is remarkable is whereas many other composers go through cycles, there's moments when they're more popular, less popular, Puccini has been a constant presence in opera theaters for 100 years. Half of his operas that he wrote have been a mainstay of opera programming throughout. Manon Lescaut, Tosca, Madame Butterfly, Bohème, and now, of course, Turandot. So that significance really is quite remarkable. The historian Julian Budden said, "No one communicates more directly with an audience than Puccini," and I think this is a testimony of that fact. I think the secret here, maybe not even much of a secret, is he maintained a constant fidelity to the Italian singing tradition. And so whereas his music is actually quite up to date, quite modern, it's not avant-garde, of course, but he kept very close to the ideal of the great tradition of not only putting voices in their best display, but also capturing wonderful melodic moments while adding a great deal of modernity in his harmonies and, of course, his orchestration. Wonderful, wonderful dramatic structure, but I think what captures people is the immediacy of the melodies that he was able to write. It's really a remarkable testimony. The Archivio Storico, of course, houses thousands of autographed manuscripts, letters, documents of a great many composers from the beginning of the firm in 1808 all the way up to today. The Archivio Storico has everything up until the 1960s, I think. The special presence of Puccini is the amount of collateral documentation. By the time Puccini's career really became important in the late 19th century, publishers had stepped into the role of what had been the role of the theatrical impresario. In other words, the publisher themselves were not only helping to commission works, but were actually taking charge of stage design, costume design, even such things as production books. Giulio Ricordi himself crafted some of the so-called disposizioni sceniche, which are production books that actually show the choreography of singers and chorus on stage. This is remarkable that the publisher should be doing this. The traditional role of the music publisher was simply to print and publish music and to monitor the rights and royalties for a composer. So Puccini comes at this moment, this juncture in history, and with a publisher who at that point is one of the most important publishers in the world, an absolute powerhouse, which not only is publishing music and of course has a large network of stores and affiliates throughout the world, but also have a very important arti grafiche division. In other words, they are one of the hallmarks of Art Nouveau, Stile Liberty art in great poster art, even such things as popularizing postcards, etc. So they were wonderfully positioned to do very modern marketing for their composer. Because of this, the kind of documentation that we have in the Archivio Storico Ricordi pertinent to Puccini is much richer than we have of most other composers of his day. So we have all the business side, we have all the publications that Ricordi itself did, and by this I mean periodicals, journals for the popular press, advertising strategies, advertising artwork, etc. So for a scholar studying Puccini, it goes so far beyond simply a matter of preserving the musical manuscripts. It was an enormous benefit. Let's state one thing right away. Puccini was an immense talent, and In any case, we would today remember Puccini as a towering composer. What we're looking at here is the influence and the importance of having such a powerful publisher as a partner. And I really mean a partner. Giulio Ricordi was actually seen by Giacomo Puccini as a father figure. And he very carefully monitored the beginning of Puccini's career. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, with the publisher becoming the impresario of theaters, it was very important as well for Ricordi to try and control the quality of performances. Let's remember what the issue was in the 19th century. Even a great work could fall if it had a bad opening night or a bad opening run. And it happened often to Verdi. The opera world is very fickle. Live performances are what they are. The reaction of the public is very difficult to affect any post-production. It's a live performance. There were actually some years in which Ricordi, changing with another Milanese publisher, were actually the official impresarios and season managers at La Scala. It's no accident that when they programmed Verdi's last two masterpieces, Otello and Falstaff, it was under Ricordi's management. So Ricordi had control of everything: costumes, set designs, promotion, etc. This bled over wonderfully into Puccini's career, which really takes off in the 1890s, which are these same years. It's interesting to note, it almost seems like something a novelist would invent, but Verdi's last great masterpiece, Falstaff, premiered just a few weeks before Puccini's first breakout success, Manon Lescaut. And a great deal of that had to do with the timing of the publisher. It's so interesting and it's so fascinating, it almost seems like fiction if it weren't historical fact. It's interesting to note that in the same time that Verdi's last great masterpiece, Falstaff, premiered at La Scala, which, and in that year, was managed by Casa Ricordi, just a few weeks later, Puccini had his first breakout success, Manon Lescaut. And it almost seems like a passing of the scepter, a passing of the baton from one king of opera to the next generation. It's just amazing. It all happens right there in the spring of 1893. And the publisher, Giulio Ricordi, is very much behind orchestrating this kind of success. Of course, he's working with two massive talents, Verdi at his very height, and Puccini finally finding his voice and finally having a breakout success. But they all happen in that same year. It's an amazing coincidence. I think what we need to bear in mind, as I said earlier, Puccini is a massive talent, and his greatness would have come through at some point. However, music history is filled with composers who were not able to realize their dreams, they weren't able to get the commissions they hoped, and especially they weren't successful in their own lifetime. We have quite a few stories of famous operas that became famous long after the death of the composer. What happens with Puccini, in the early part of his career, Giulio Ricordi had understood the talent of this man. Giulio Ricordi was famous as being a talent scout, and his first two operas were excellent, Willi in 1884, Edgar in 1889. Both operas were refashioned after an unsuccessful opening, suggested by Giulio Ricordi, who was also himself an excellent musician. So Willi was turned into a two-act opera and became more successful. Edgar was trimmed down from being too long, from 4 acts to 3 acts. But nonetheless, they weren't economically successful. And the board of Casa Ricordi, in any other situation, they were worried about the investments that were being made. Giulio stuck by this composer and said, no, he will really become something. And it's remarkable that he did, against the opposition of his own Consiglio di Amministrazione, as it was there at Casa Ricordi. He was proved right in 1893. With Manon Lescaut, just catapulted him to international fame, and after that we get Bohème, and after that we get Tosca, and so forth. Now, of course, this paid off handsomely for the publisher, but also Puccini had this opportunity, he had this patron, he had this backing of a publisher that had become so powerful worldwide. You know, in 1911, the New York Times, absolutely with admiration and some touch of envy, I think, because they, as Americans, they were thinking, we're the ones that know commerce. And here comes this Italian company and is teaching all of us how to do massive marketing campaigns. And they refer to it as the Opera Trust, the House of Ricordi, which I'm quoting from the New York Times, said they have been a dominant force in operatic history for 100 years. So Puccini, to summarize, Puccini certainly would have had the opportunity to prove his talent. Maybe not have had the opportunity to have so many operas commissioned, but he never would have become this enormous economic success that he became if it weren't for a powerhouse like Casa Ricordi. And when he died, his estate was quite remarkable for a classical composer, well over 200 million euro in today's money when he passed away in 1924. For a classical composer, these are astonishing numbers. And that comes, I think, from this synergy with such a powerful publisher. We knew that in 2024 there would be all manner of conferences, meetings, productions, exhibits that would focus on Puccini the composer, Puccini the person, all sorts of other background and stories. What we found interesting, especially because of the holdings of the Archivio Storico that can reveal so much about cultural context, about business history, about economic history, things that many musicologists themselves and many opera lovers don't think about. When I first proposed this in 2019, it's been a while, I said, why don't we talk about 20th century Puccini? And by 20th century Puccini, I didn't mean that he changed his style. It does evolve. What happens in the 20th century is we go from the Belle Epoque of horse-drawn carriages and you know, a whole different kind of lifestyle into the 20th century, and suddenly some things were simply curiosities. Cinema, records, they were just novelties that maybe you would see at a carnival, or maybe you would see, it wasn't home entertainment, as it were. Suddenly it exploded. It became a market. Production costs came down, sales costs came down, quality improved, and suddenly an enormous market that no one had ever thought about started to fall in love with opera. In part, it was helped by two factors. Cinema was attracted to the world of opera because of the way it was staged. If we look at prose theater, you never get two people talking at the same time. You don't get large choral movements. In opera, you have 6 people singing at the same time, each expressing different thoughts, and you have very large choral movements. This was fascinating to the world of cinema. So early attraction to opera for movies started to come from there. And don't forget, there really was never any such thing as silent movies. What became a novelty was synchronized sound, but movies were almost always accompanied by some form of music and even sound effects, and sometimes reciting actors and singers. And then records. What records allowed you to do were to listen to great voices in your own home, in a cafe, and listen to them over and over. In the beginning, Casa Ricordi, of course, was worried about this. The younger Ricordi, Tito II, who had studied as an engineer, was fascinated by the new technology. His father, Giulio, was worried, how do we collect rights and royalties? If you can play the same record over and over, always perfect, how do we monitor performance rights? Because performing rights in Europe had become understood at the end of the 19th century, but that was for live performance. So they were collecting royalties for live performance. But if I buy a record and go home and play it 100 times for 100 different people, how does the composer, how does the publisher fit themselves into that model? And especially, there's another side to the coin. The publisher was worried about their business model, but in the beginning, what they weren't aware is this was an enormous promotional tool. A very, very broad audience that had never stepped into an opera house and may never step into an opera house suddenly started falling in love with his repertory because early acoustic recordings were excellent for reproducing the human voice. And a trained operatic voice came across wonderfully in early recordings when they were literally singing into a horn, and each record in the very beginning was literally engraved on a new cylinder or on a new disc. So it was the perfect match. So this disruption struck us as so interesting. You have new technologies, but several different types of new technologies. The publisher has to be concerned with which one will win out. Also, is this a disruption to my business model, or can this be turned into an advantage? And legislation was far behind. Every country protected rights in a different way. Singularly, America, for instance, had throughout the 19th century allowed American publishers to freely print and copy foreign works. So there had to be a lot of work of the publisher, working even at a level of legislation, because the early creators of recordings didn't see why they needed to pay rights. They said, well, we went to the problem to create this master and on this support, and so we alone should be able to collect money from this. It's very interesting. So all of this coming together in the years between 1902, let's say, and 1925, which exactly corresponds to the second half of Puccini's career, just struck us as absolutely fascinating. And of course, the resources of the Archivio Storico gives us a wealth of documentation to be able to support the arguments that we were making. So we thought we would make, with this exhibition, a particularly unique contribution. One last point. It doesn't escape notice how close this is to what is happening today in the 21st century. The same kind of issues. Music streaming, artificial intelligence, new forms of piracy, new forms of plagiarism, and arguments against copyright. People who feel that copyright shouldn't exist anymore, and creators who are saying, we need to be able to protect our intellectual property. The reflection between the early 20th century and the early 21st century is absolutely captivating. So we thought, what a perfect time to do an exhibit like this. I think he was influenced by what was going on in cinema. In other words, one thing that was done before the world of synchronized sound in cinema, and to keep the audience engaged, they had live sound effects. There were movies that showed airplanes and they would make motor noises. They would have people behind the screen shouting and etc. because there was always an audio component. We call it silent cinema, but that's a misnomer. It wasn't synchronized is what it was. Although they did play records. They were brief cinema that we know about, where they would take a recording and they would have actors mime the singing. There's a number of famous clips that we know, pretending to sing something from Rigoletto or something from Lucia di Lammermoor. And that caused another layer of problems, because here you had not only the audio, but you had the visual as well, taking away audience from what the publisher was doing. These were only short clips, but Thomas Edison, as early as the late 1870s, said that his ultimate goal was to see an entire Wagner opera performed from beginning to end, just like you would see it at the Metropolitan. Imagine what fear that struck into publishers, saying, where are we going? And we think today, oh, the quality wasn't all that good. But we need to remember that with each new technology, the audience at that time is fascinated by it. They don't see the defects. We see defects when we listen to a 100-year-old record. But the people at the time were absolutely captivated. There's a letter in the Archivio Ricordi. We don't have it here, but Giulio Ricordi had received a record of a band playing. And he had it played on a gramophone in his office. And some people came in from the outside saying, where's the band? It sounded real enough to them that they thought an actual band was in his office playing. So we need to remember that. So to get back to the main point of the question, Puccini did end up incorporating sound effects, as it were. He had always used things like church bells and things. But for instance, in Tabata, we have an automobile horn. There are street sounds of Paris and river sounds of Paris, and I think that's pretty clearly influenced by the kinds of spectacles that were being done in cinema at that time. I think we need to think of two levels. One is copyright, and one is performance royalties, performance rights. And it becomes very important. Again, there seems to be a direct reflection with what happens today. On the one hand, how does the rights owner, the copyright holder, who then pays the composer, the publisher in this case, how do they monitor the sales? How do they keep after how many records are you selling and how many times do you play them and how many people are hearing them? The same with cinema. And they had to come up with means. For instance, with records, they came up with a solution of selling individual labels, a certain number of labels that you would stamp on each record, otherwise it was not an official record. Some of the recordings that we have on display, some of the discs, you can see the little label that says authorized by Casa Ricordi. And with cinema, they ended up coming out with a variation of what happened in live theater. You would pay a certain amount of money depending on how many people attended, how many ticket sales there were. The performance rights were much more difficult to monitor. And whereas they had been recognized from the middle of the 19th century in Paris and soon thereafter in Italy, Puccini gets to the United States and writes a letter of complaint in 1907 to a New York newspaper. It's very interesting. It's very, very cordial. But he says, how is it that the singers are paid a very handsome fee and they're even allowed royalties for singing my songs, but I don't get a penny from these performances? And indeed, he goes on to say, if I were to make recordings of my own music that would compete with these, the recording companies could sue me. And so clearly there had to be legislation that would accommodate for this fact that in different territories, in different countries, there were different ways that they were handling rights and royalties. In America, a very important law finally came in 1909, but that's a long time after the Berne Convention, which is from 1886, which helped European countries standardize to some extent how copyright was protected. So there's the copyright and there's the performance rights. I also mentioned that there was this chance meeting in New York between Giacomo Puccini and the operetta composer, very successful, who they were playing, I believe, there's two different versions of the story. In one case, they were playing some music by the operetta composer, and another one, they were playing some music in a restaurant, a small chamber group of Puccini's. And when Puccini asked, do they pay? And the answer was no. In America, no. And so we said, in Italy, they would. In Italy, this performance would be paid. And that led almost directly to the founding of ASCAP, the Association of Authors, Composers, and Publishers in the United States in 1914, out of a conversation with Puccini. They even mentioned that on their own website, that that's how it got its start. So bringing together these different ideas of finding some normalization of copyright, and especially performance rights, and as we go forward, performance rights extended to mechanical rights, because performance rights had always been seen as, I pay for a live performance. Well, how do you deal with records? Because there's this other factor as well to bear in mind. There had always been home entertainment. People buy sheet music, they take it at home, they play it in the family, they play it for a group, etc. But it's one thing if you and your sister and your cousin play on a few instruments at home, even if you're very good. It's another thing to bring home a record of Enrico Caruso singing a song. Now you've got a top singer in the world who, if you lived in a small city, you would never even hear him if you couldn't go to Milan or Paris or New York. And now you can buy a recording and it proliferates everywhere. Something has to be done to control mechanical rights too. There's one other factor, and that is an evolution of piracy. Now, piracy has always existed in music publishing, just as in book publishing. A rival, unauthorized, prints a copy of your book, or they will make a copy of your music and they'll perform it in a theater. You have to chase after them, but that's just straightforward piracy. What begins to happen in the 20th century is a form of plagiarism whereby these famous tunes that people have been hearing on the records are now adopted by pop music. And whereas pop and folk music was not a big business up until the early part of the 20th century, it suddenly becomes so. A piece of sheet music from, I think, 1892, I'm quoting by memory now, sold 2 million copies. These are numbers no classical music publisher could imagine. And it sold many more copies after that. And so we have this case that we talk about, Avalon, and another one called Cho-Cho-San, where an enormously famous jazz singer, Al Jolson, co-signs a piece that blatantly takes one of the most famous melodies from Tosca. They win the lawsuit, get a considerable amount of money, but there's another factor here as well, moral rights. The composer said, I never authorized this. Even if it's an attractive piece of music, you didn't have my permission to do it. And this raises an entire different specter of a kind of piracy that had never existed before. And it wouldn't have been a problem if it weren't so commercially lucrative. So suddenly, here comes another disruption. This happens in the 1920s, and these are things that had never been foreseen. There had always been people that would write transcriptions and adaptations of classical music, but they were usually very, very high end. I mentioned, Liszt writing fantasies, very, very difficult piano fantasies on the music of Donizetti. That was fine. Some of those were commissioned by Ricordi themselves. But here you get this new phenomenon of a type of music that is so different from what the composer is writing, and the composer is saying, I should at least be given the opportunity to give you permission or to have some say in how this music is done. So there again, a whole new world that happens in the 20th century that no one had foreseen in the 19th century. I think it was very important, and it was important also for a new approach to what we might call today creating a fan base. Not so much creating a star. Of course, composers were always, classical composers were stars in their own day. People would create all sorts of imagery around them, Verdi, I mentioned Franz Liszt, etc. What begins to happen with Puccini is the ease of travel, transatlantic travel. Julian Budden mentioned also that part of the success of Giuseppe Verdi in the late 19th century was the facility of railroad travel everywhere throughout Europe, made hopping back and forth from one city to the next so easy. It used to take weeks and weeks and weeks to go from Rome to Paris, and suddenly became a one-day trip. By the same token, less than a week you can now go overseas. And there were important new markets opening up that had never been thought of before as being so commercially important. So you have Puccini traveling to Buenos Aires. You have Puccini that has an enormous Italian population, and so the Italian opera is a repertory that they're in love with. You have New York, Chicago, Boston. In 1907, Puccini travels there as well to supervise and witness a number of performances enormously successful of his operas. And then he's actually commissioned to write world premieres. This hadn't happened before. So a world premiere overseas in New York of La Fanciulla del West. And then in 1918 of the Trittico. He had planned to go, but in the end he couldn't go because World War I had ended, but there was still the danger of mines in the ocean, and so it was too dangerous to go. But nonetheless, a world premiere, once again, of another Puccini opera. So this ability to travel so far and wide and open up the repertory in person to new audiences that were very, very well-to-do audiences and who were attracted to the world of Italian opera. That helped as well in a very great deal. Then what did Ricordi do with these trips? They turned them into enormous events that they would publish in their magazines. Puccini's traveling, here's Puccini in Buenos Aires, here's Puccini being, an enormous crowd is throwing him a gala dinner and caricatures and all these sorts of things. Even back in Europe, this enormously built up, as I mentioned, the fan base for the composer. So I wouldn't call it the cult of the personality, but it's very modern in the way that the composers were now, they're no longer in their ivory tower. They're now, here's Puccini on his motorboat. Here's Puccini out duck hunting. Here he is having a glass of wine with some friends. And it all helped build this enormous attraction around the composer, which then, of course, reflected in the popularity of his music and the programming in the operas. It was quite remarkable that you have Ricordi doing this in the 1890s and the early 1900s. This is the kind of marketing that would come into the industrial sphere, automobiles, etc., much later in the century. And to think that a music publisher was doing this 20 years earlier is quite striking. I launched the basic idea in November of 2019. We were in Manhattan. We had just set up the New York launch of the exhibit of Verdi, Otello, and Boito, the Enterprise of Opera that was so successful here in Berlin and later in Brussels and in Milan. And so a very successful opening in New York too. And just over lunch, we were thinking, what do we do next? And I said, how about 20th century Puccini? And my colleagues from the Archivio Storico and from Bertelsmann were quite intrigued. So, of course, then COVID hit. After that, everything was discussions over Zoom and emails, hundreds and hundreds of meetings and these sorts of things. The basic idea started coming into focus later in 2021 with a number of possibilities that this kind of a topic can take. Of course, we did as much cutting as we did focusing. All sorts of ideas came up over time. Should we do this? Should we do that? Should we focus on the other thing? The real heavy work started a year ago, May. And I brought in the two co-curators, two excellent professors, Christy Adams and Ellen Lockhart, specialists in the fields that they'll be curating, in early film studies with opera, and of course, the early world of merchandising and branding, etc. So together, we brought together, got the catalog ready, team of experts from the design team, a number of outstanding people, and it was very much like putting together an opera. Right up until the last minute, I said, when things didn't seem like they were coming together, I said, trust me, this is no different than staging an opera. We had so many things coming together all at once, and it worked out brilliantly because there were so many brilliant people working on it, and I was thrilled to watch them, all these experts, bring all this together. It's just really exciting to see. I think they're all very fascinating, but as a Puccini scholar, I think the one that's most striking for me, and I'm so happy that we can show it, are his last sketches for Turandot, because this is also a remarkable story all by itself. It could have been left as an unfinished work. Before Puccini became ill, they were planning to do Turandot, the world premiere, a year earlier. Then his cancer got worse and worse. He was still convinced he could bring it to fruition, but the fact is he ran into a terrible writer's block. There was a long, long time that he wasn't able to finish this closing scene, this closing duet. So we see this remarkable last page that Puccini himself writes and it's assigned to the publisher. We see the first page of the completion. The publisher decides to commission a completion of the work, a remarkable, remarkable choice. And it would have been under the supervision of Arturo Toscanini, who knew Puccini's music so well, and in fact had premiered many of Puccini's works. He had spoken with Puccini near the end of his life, and Puccini had played for him some of what he had planned for the finale. Remarkably and touchingly, at the first performance, Toscanini stopped where Puccini had stopped writing, turned to the audience and said, "Here the composer laid down his pen." Probably one of the most moving moments in all of music history. After that, they played it with the Alfano ending, and Turandot with Alfano ending now is inseparable as a unique, as a complete piece. But the opportunity for people to see these last sketches, even if you're not a musician, if you are a musician, you will be amazed at how chaotic they seem. A composer will recognize them, that they're notes to myself. You know, they're not meant for public consumption. We also see how difficult Alfano's task was to finish what he had to work with. But for someone who isn't a musician, the graphic impact of these sketches, which have never been shown in public before, I think is really very moving. These are the testimonials of the last moments of a great composer's creative process. And just to be able to see these, like seeing a sketch by Michelangelo or seeing an early draft by Leonardo, it's the same kind of a visual impact. It's really very moving. I think, for me, that's one of the most gripping things that we'll see here in this display. I think that's an excellent example. The AI creation that has been made from the 5 set designs from 1926 of Turandot and bringing them to almost 3-dimensional life and animating them. That's a wonderful extension of creation. Even the 3D rendition of the bust of Puccini. These are reinterpretations, and they have a direct analogy. Every time an opera is staged, you're free to do it the way you like. We've gotten so far away, some people even complain. They pay no attention to the original stage directions, and they might do Bohème in a completely different setting, or they might do another opera in a completely different way. But this is part of creative input as well. This is part of creative collaboration. One of the things that keeps opera so alive for new audiences is you can stage it exactly the way it was thought of in the original, and you can use those stage directions, but you can also expand it greatly. And I think when AI is used for those reasons, that's a very, very creative. It's not intrusive. Indeed, it opens up whole new worlds, and I think that's part of what these things were meant to be. I mean, the score itself that the composer writes, and he has it all in his head, but once it's staged, it's out of his hands. The single interpreters will always do it in a different way. If we're talking about live performance, really no 2 evenings are the same. But then we talk about different productions. You know, they're going to produce something like 2,800 performances of Puccini operas this year. In 970, I read recently, different theaters. No 2 are going to be alike, and that's wonderful. That's exactly the kind of expansion of creativity that you want. You use this basic core of a creative thought, of a creative idea that was at its core collaborative, and now it becomes something that is for the audiences of 2024, and tomorrow the audiences of 2050. So if these new technologies, and whatever will come in the future, are used to enhance and enrich what is the core of the intellectual property, I'm all for that. I think it's very exciting to see it in person. I've only seen it on PDFs, and I've only seen it through a computer screen. It's even more engaging than what I thought. The design is so creative, so brilliant. I think there's been an excellent mix of what we need of video, audio, slideshows, and just enough information that I think the audience can feel really engaged. There's also this topic is not an easy thing to explain. Very few people think about, and it seems terribly boring, the whole world of copyright, performance rights. But there's also to be borne in mind, this is the lifeblood of what keeps this kind of, let's call it a business, going. Especially musicologists very often only want to think about the creative process and the individual composer with his pen and his piece of paper, staring out a window, waiting for inspiration to strike. I think we even have the opportunity to show people the deep concern that composers have, as well as publishers, that their work is correctly represented. The integrity of their artistic creation, quite apart the fact that you might earn money from it. But the integrity of the artistic creation and how it's best represented and best disseminated and best transmitted, I think that's an important point that we bring across. And again, as I mentioned, It's something that I think the average visitor will understand on their own. There's a deep connection with our own time here. The things that were happening in 1905 are the things that we've seen happen in 2005 and are still happening in 2024. It's really quite interesting with the afterward, with, as I said, streaming, artificial intelligence, even artificial creation of music, and then repurposing of existing music, etc. These are all challenges to intellectual creativity that were seen in the same light in the early 20th century. And I think the connection there is fascinating. And I think the way that it's designed, the way it's laid out, apart from the fact it's absolutely beautiful, of course. We have these costumes, we have these sets, we have these beautiful items, and many items that very few experts even know that we pulled out. So there's fascination for everyone, but visually the impact is just stunning. So I was thrilled, of course.